Colonel laughed at her old photo, until he recognized the mission behind it is that's supposed to impress someone, sweetheart? Because all I see is a little girl playing dress-up in a dead man's coat. The words cut through the briefing room like a blade scraping the flat of a bayonet. Slow, deliberate, built to carry. Colonel Raymond Holt had a voice designed for auditoriums. Resonant, calibrated, the kind that expected walls to absorb it and return it amplified. 26 years had gone into that voice. He deployed it now with the easy pleasure of a man who has never once considered that a tool can be turned around. 43 people stood at the room's perimeter. Intelligence analysts with color-coded lanyards, expressions held carefully neutral. 2 range instructors with clipboards pressed against their forearms. A maintenance crew of 4 that had paused mid-task the moment the colonel's footsteps echoed through the outer corridor. The specific pause of people who have learned to read authority arriving before it enters a room. A row of junior officers in pressed utilities, rigid and attentive. Watching for cues the way junior officers always watch, for permission, for the shape of the moment so they could arrange themselves correctly inside it. Every one of them heard what he said. Every one of them waited. The woman at the center table did not look up. She was 31 years old. Medium height. A regulation bun, brown, pinned with zero concession to anything decorative. She wore a standard-issue utility uniform, pressed clean, with no rank insignia on the collar tabs, just a contractor's access badge clipped to her left breast pocket, white lanyard, the kind that got you through 3 checkpoints and no further. Her hands were moving through the disassembled components of an M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle, laying each piece on a clean cloth in sequence with the methodical patience of someone for whom the procedure required no thought at all. Lower receiver, upper receiver, barrel assembly, bolt carrier group, gas block, handguard, dust cover. Each piece touching the cloth at the same angle. Each piece positioned the same distance from its neighbor. The grip was not right. Not wrong, exactly. The word was too correct, too practiced, too certain. The specific angle of the wrists and deliberate spacing of the fingers that Rangemaster Devlin Ellis, standing at the eastern wall with his clipboard, had seen at exactly 2 training programs in 31 years. Neither appeared anywhere on a standard contractor's file. Neither was the kind of program a civilian contractor attended. Ellis said nothing. He was a man who had learned to notice first and speak carefully afterward. What he was noticing now asked him to be very careful. Holt's shadow fell across her workspace as he stepped closer. He wore 4 rows of service ribbons above his left breast pocket. His arms were crossed in a way that communicated ownership, not of this room specifically, but of this base, and by extension the Atlantic Fleet, and by further extension the entire architecture of military authority in all its recognized forms. He was not performing arrogance. He was a man for whom arrogance had long ago calcified into simple expectation. He expected her to look up. She did not look up. She lifted the barrel assembly, rotated it 90 degrees, examined the bore with the focused attention of someone who would notice if something was wrong and would not put it back until it was not. She set it down, picked up the bolt carrier group. "I asked you a question," he said. She set the bolt carrier group down, aligned it precisely with the others. Then she raised her eyes to meet his, and there was nothing in her expression that constituted a reaction to him, not deference, not resentment, not the flinch that most people produced when Colonel Holt focused his full attention on them. Just a pair of eyes, waiting for what came next. Calm the way that very still water is calm. The kind of stillness that suggests depth rather than absence. "I heard you, sir. Nothing more." She returned to the rifle. Something moved across Holt's face. Amusement, primarily, threaded with something sharper that he did not examine. He turned to the room with a half grin, the grin of a man inviting an audience into a private joke. And the junior officers shifted, and two analysts exchanged the kind of glance that was already assembling a story to tell later. "We've got a ghost here, gentlemen," Holt said, performing it for the room the way he always performed for rooms. No rank, no unit, no identification of consequence. "She's in my briefing room, touching my equipment, with apparently nothing to say for herself." He leaned toward her slightly, dropping his voice to the register meant to feel like intimacy and functioning as enclosure. "So I'll try once more, sweetheart. Who are you, and what exactly are you doing in my facility?" She slid the barrel assembly back into the upper receiver. One smooth, unhesitating push. The click of the assembly seating was clean and precise. "I'm exactly who my badge says I am. Colonel." Then she picked up the gas block and went back to work. The grin remained on Holt's face, but something behind it recalibrated. He straightened, swept the room with his eyes to reclaim its attention. A few junior officers managed small sounds of amusement, not quite laughs, but the social currency of men who understood which direction was up. Holt walked back to the head of the room and resumed the briefing without acknowledging her further, the kind of dismissal designed to be louder than any insult. In the far left corner, near the door accessing the equipment corridor, a man stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the woman at the center table. His name was Master Sergeant Archibald Crane. He was 62 years old. 34 years of continuous service, which meant he had been in uniform longer than several people in this room had been alive. He had a face built from weather and patience, deeply lined around the eyes in the way that comes from years of watching landscapes for things other people miss. He carried a calibration report intended for Range Master Ellis. He had arrived in the doorway, seen the woman at the table, and stopped walking. His pen had stopped moving the moment he saw the grip. He had seen that grip twice in 34 years, both times at programs he did not discuss with anyone who lacked the specific clearances required to know those programs existed. He watched her now through narrowed eyes, cataloging details the way he had cataloged details for 3 decades, building a picture from those details that did not match a single thing on her contractor's badge. He watched her breathe. 4 counts in, hold. 4 counts out. Hold, not accidental. Trained, the specific ventilation pattern of someone taught to keep their nervous system under deliberate active control when pressure climbs. He knew that pattern. He had learned it in a schoolhouse that appeared on no public curriculum. He capped his pen. He stayed where he was and said nothing. Not yet. His job right now was to watch. The afternoon brought new indignities. By 1400, Colonel Holt's version of the morning had traveled through 4 group chats and the full length of the mess hall lunch line. By the time it reached the far end of the queue, it had been embellished with each successive telling in the specific ways that institutional gossip embellishes when it wants to be entertaining. She'd been rude. She'd been incoherent. She'd claimed credentials she couldn't produce and wasted 30 minutes of the colonel's briefing time before he had her removed. By 1330, the story had a nickname: the Ghost Contractor. By 1400, the ghost contractor who thought she belonged in the weapons room. She sat alone at the far end of a long table with a tray that held rice, a protein block, and something identified on the serving board as a roasted vegetable that tasted primarily of institutional efficiency. She ate slowly and listened with the specific focus of someone who has spent years learning to use ambient noise as data. In 37 minutes of mess hall observation, she identified the names of Holt's 3 closest subordinates through unguarded conversation at adjacent tables. She confirmed which of the 2 senior intelligence analysts held independent database access. She noted, with professional interest, that a certain Captain Villanueva, whose name appeared in her pre-mission documentation as a person of secondary interest, ate lunch with his back to the wall and finished before everyone else and left through the service entrance rather than the main door. Pattern behavior. The kind of behavior that said either cautious by nature or cautious for a reason. She filed all of it. She was doing intelligence work while appearing to be an isolated target. Not unusual. Exactly standard. At 1500, she took position at a secure terminal in the Eastern Data Corridor and began the monthly network authentication sequence. The access code rotated on a 43-day cycle, changed at randomized intervals, and required an 18-character alphanumeric input in a specific order. The average operator took 4 to 6 minutes. Some, encountering the full sequence fresh, took closer to 8. She completed the input in 7 seconds. Staff Sergeant Dominic Pincourt, who handled network access for the Eastern Corridor and had been watching the terminal from 3 desks over because the authentication screen was visible from his workstation and the timing looked wrong, sat completely motionless for 4 seconds after she finished. 7 seconds. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at her. He looked at the timestamp again. She noticed him noticing. She moved to the next task without acknowledging it. Near the water station at the corridor's end, Master Sergeant Crane appeared with what was technically his 3rd report delivery of the day to this section of the building. He did not deliver the report immediately. He stood at the water station for 90 seconds, longer than filling a cup required, and watched her complete the authentication sequence. He watched the timestamp register. He knew exactly what that number meant. His pen did not move. He left without speaking to anyone. At 15:12, her sleeve shifted as she reached for the keyboard, writing up 2 inches on her right forearm. The skin underneath showed a scar, not surgical, not clean, not the deliberate line of a procedure, jagged and raised, with the irregular edges that come from a fragment traveling at high speed through fabric and finding flesh. The kind of wound that happens when someone is too close to something when it detonates. Rangemaster Ellis, who had drifted into the Eastern Corridor on some pretext involving an equipment checklist, was standing 12 feet away when the sleeve shifted. He stopped checking his list. His eyes went to the scar. His pen did not exactly stop. He was not a man who showed things easily, but the interval between check marks became noticeably longer. She pulled her sleeve down. At 16:30, Colonel Holt filed a formal credentials review request through the Inspector General's protocol interface, citing security concerns regarding unverified contractor access to classified materials and sensitive equipment. He used the correct form. He filed it through the correct office. He was, by the full letter of base procedure, doing exactly what a commanding officer was supposed to do. He did not consider that a formal filing created a formal record. He did not consider that formal records had automated responses embedded in the base's security architecture, notifications that routed to offices entirely outside his knowledge and entirely outside his command structure. He had spent 26 years in a system where filing a form meant you had taken action. He had not spent those years learning the difference between taking action and triggering a chain reaction. The summons arrived at her terminal at 16:57. Administrative Room 4. 1700 hours. She controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. She gathered her badge, left the rifle components aligned precisely on their cloth, each piece exactly where she'd placed it. and walked through the door without looking at the faces tracking her movement. Administrative Room 4 had a metal bench bolted to the west wall. Concrete block, government fluorescent lighting that drained color from everything it touched, and a window near the ceiling showing a strip of evening sky exactly wide enough to confirm the world outside still existed. It smelled of industrial disinfectant and something older underneath. The accumulated weight of a room that had processed bad news for years and absorbed all of it without changing. Captain Morales conducted the review, 28 years old, careful, genuinely trying to do his job correctly. She noted this with professional precision. He was following orders, not generating them. What were you doing at 0500 this morning? System diagnostics. Why at 0500? Light traffic on the network. Better performance data. Do you have authorization for independent system access at that hour? Authorization code K7 Whiskey Delta 9. It's on file with the Access Management Office. Can you walk me through your current clearance level? I'm not able to do that with you, Captain. Morales set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating the conversation he thought he was having. That's a refusal to cooperate with an official review. No, sir. It's an accurate statement about clearance architecture. I'm not able to walk you through my clearance level with you. Specifically, the distinction matters. He studied her for a moment. Then, he picked up his pen and wrote something she could not read from her angle. The interview continued in this manner for 40 minutes. Him asking precise procedural questions, her answering with precise procedural minimums. The atmosphere in the room becoming gradually more taut in the way that happens when two people are operating on entirely different bodies of information, and only one of them knows it. The formal outcome arrived at 1930. Credential suspension pending full review. She was to remain on base, confined to temporary quarters, no system access, no contact with ongoing operations, no communication outside the perimeter without approval. Her contractor's badge went into an evidence envelope that Morales sealed and signed with the careful expression of a man hoping he is doing the right thing. She cooperated with complete, unremarkable calm. Her temporary quarters were small, one regulation cot, one desk, one window facing the parking lot. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the window. Then she looked at the watch on her wrist. Titanium band. Simple face. Military issue. Nobody had asked for it. Nobody had thought to. Her watch read 2017. She breathed. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. In 23 minutes, an automated check-in protocol she had established through a secure channel before she'd boarded the aircraft that brought her here would register her failure to respond. The protocol routed to an office in Washington that did not appear in any of Colonel Holt's operational briefings and was not accessible through any database he held clearance to access. When the check-in failed, the protocol would flag her situation automatically and generate a notification to a contact whose job title, if it appeared anywhere, would not accurately describe what that person actually did. In 61 minutes, a second protocol, filed with a third office entirely, filed 93 days ago when the operation was still in the planning phase, would activate. It would append the notification with her current operational status, location, and the circumstances of her credential suspension. Simultaneously, it would trigger a formal inquiry flag attached to the name of the officer who had filed the credentials review request. Colonel Raymond Holt's name. In approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, Colonel Raymond Holt was going to learn the precise and permanent difference between apparent authority and real power. He was going to learn it in front of witnesses, in his own building, in a room where she had been held as though she were a problem he had already solved. She did not smile at this. She thought about a man named Torres who had gone into the field 10 months ago on an operation that was supposed to have support assets in position. About the file she had built over 14 weeks from the Eastern Corridor's data transfer logs. About 3 names she had confirmed. And she thought about the 4th. She controlled her breathing and waited. This is the near-fail moment. The point where anyone watching from outside would think she's finished. Caught. Game over. Except games have rules. And she was about to show them they had been playing the wrong game entirely. The first crack came at 21:48. Colonel Holt was at his desk reviewing after-action summaries from the morning's field exercises when Master Sergeant Crane knocked once on the open door and stood in the frame. Crane almost never came to the second floor. Crane almost never approached anyone above the rank of major with something that wasn't paperwork. "Sergeant," Holt said without looking up. "Colonel." A pause. 3 beats. Deliberate, not hesitation. "I'd be very careful about the contractor." Holt looked up. Crane's face was what it always was, professionally arranged, revealing nothing beyond the words he chose to say. But his eyes held something Holt could not properly categorize. Not challenge. Not warning, exactly. Something closer to a man watching someone accelerate toward a concrete barrier and making a single final calculation about whether to shout. "The contractor," Holt said, "is suspended pending a formal review. I'd say that's the appropriate level of careful." "Yes, sir," Crane said. He held Holt's gaze one more beat. Then he nodded fractionally and left. Holt returned to his summaries. He did not mention the exchange in his evening log. He did not think about it again until much later, when he would wish he had. At 22:03, the front gate logged 4 vehicles. Federal plates. 2 bore sequences that, when entered into the standard verification database, returned only a placeholder reference number. The duty officer called the number. The call was answered in 2 rings. A woman's voice asked for the reference number to be read back, confirmed it, and told the duty officer to raise the barrier without logging the plates in the standard visitor's register. He raised the barrier. By 22:09, the vehicles had parked in the senior officer's lot, and 4 figures were walking toward the administration building at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual. Not standard transport. Command movement. The lead figure wore 2 stars. A Major General, Ferris, whose name, had anyone thought to check, appeared in none of the organizational charts accessible to Fort Barrister's staff. Behind him, a Brigadier General. Behind both, 2 individuals in civilian dress, whose badges produced the same 30-second silence from the checkpoint guard that they had produced at the gate, before the guard straightened his posture and stepped aside. Holt was in the main corridor when they came through the inner door. He had been notified of unusual gate activity 4 minutes earlier and had come down to address it personally, exactly the kind of proactive response a commanding officer was supposed to demonstrate. He saw Ferris. He went slightly pale, not visibly, not dramatically, but the blood behind his face made a brief redistribution that an experienced observer would have caught. "General Ferris," he said. His voice carried its full authority. "An extraordinary performance under the circumstances. This is unexpected." "How can I? Where is she, Colonel?" Not a question. The inflection of a man for whom questions were a professional courtesy he was not obligated to extend at this moment. Holt gave the room number. They moved past him. In the corner of the main corridor, near the door to the equipment bay, Master Sergeant Crane stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He had been there for 8 minutes. He had come without being summoned, through the simple mechanism of having watched the vehicles arrive from a second-floor window and having decided, with 34 years of pattern recognition behind the decision, that this was where he needed to be. He watched them pass. His face remained what it always was. But something in his chest, the held breath that had been building since that morning, since the moment he'd watched those wrists hold a rifle barrel at an angle that only 2 programs in the world taught, had begun, very quietly, to release. She was sitting at the edge of the cot when the door opened. She stood before the door had fully swung, not startled, not reactive, just in motion, the body's trained response to a changed situation. She checked her watch, 22:30. Then, she looked at the door. General Ferris entered. He was 61 years old and had the specific stillness of someone who had stopped needing to perform authority decades ago because he simply possessed it. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that had no easy name, a weight carried between recognition and the cost of knowing what the last 14 weeks had required. "Commander," he said. He stepped aside. The woman in the dark suit, civilian dress, federal credentials, a folder under one arm, entered and set the folder on the metal bench. She opened it with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this part many times and found nothing dramatic in it, and removed a single document, orders printed on heavyweight paper, classified red stamped across the top margin in block letters, with a classification designation exceeding the clearance of every person currently assigned to Fort Barrister, including its commanding officer. She held the document toward Colonel Holt, who had followed them in, and now stood in the doorway. It was important, in what was about to happen, that he hold it himself and read it himself and understand that no second-hand account of this moment would exist for him to revise later. He took it. He read it. His face cycled through states. Surprise arrived first and was immediately displaced by something else, a rapid, visible restructuring. The expression of a man whose brain has received information that requires it to rebuild an entire context from the foundation up. Then, something settled in his eyes that was not surprise, and not anger, and not confusion. The thing that arrives after understanding lands. Fear. Real fear. The kind that does not perform. His hand drifted toward his collar and stopped when he noticed it moving, and brought it deliberately back to his side. "I need someone to explain the chain of," he started. "Nothing needs to be explained to you, Colonel." The woman in the dark suit said it gently. Gentle was worse. "Everything has been explained. You've been reading it for the last 30 seconds. She turned away from him, to the woman standing by the cot. "Commander Voss," she said. "Your credentials." Commander Voss reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and removed a badge. Not the contractor's badge, sealed now in an evidence envelope 2 rooms away. The other one. The one she had been carrying against her sternum for 14 weeks, worn in the interior pocket of a jacket she had never once taken off, like the thing she'd come back for when everything else was stripped away. She held it out toward Holt. The designation read, Naval Special Warfare Command, Commanding Officer, Tier 1 Special Operations, Classification, Black Shelf Access Level 7. Holt looked at it. She lowered the badge and reached with 2 fingers to her right sleeve, rolling it up exactly 2 inches. The inside of her forearm showed a tattoo, a trident, crossed with an anchor and an eagle, a pistol barrel aimed upward, the composition surrounded by 8 digits, forming a call sign issued only within a specific program, and recognized only by those who had been through it. The linework was years old. Not decorative. Not commemorative. Operational. The kind of mark that told anyone trained to read it exactly who was standing in front of them, exactly what they had done, and exactly what level of authority they carried. General Ferris went rigid. His hand moved before his brain had fully authorized it. Up, clean, palm forward, the automatic salute of a man whose body knew what was required before his conscious mind had caught up. The angle of his wrist was perfect, the kind of salute given to fewer than 30 people in any given decade. The brigadier behind him followed 2 seconds later. Eyes forward. Face set. Not standard. Chosen, Captain Morales, who had entered the room from the corridor because he had seen the generals moving and followed at a professionally appropriate distance, raised his right hand to his temple before he had fully processed the decision to do so. His arm went up, and his eyes found the tattoo and stayed there. From the doorway, filling the space the generals had left, Master Sergeant Archibald Crane stood with his feet together and his right hand raised in a salute that moved slower than the others. Not ceremonially slow, deliberate, the salute of a man who had decided to do this, who had the full knowledge of what it meant and the full understanding that he could have stood differently and was choosing not to. His eyes found hers over the tops of the general's salutes. He held her gaze. The room detonated. Gasps, actual audible gasps, multiple, from the 4 personnel accumulated in the corridor outside, moved through the air like a physical event. Someone dropped a tablet. The crack of it hitting concrete echoed through the room like a gunshot in the sudden, compressed silence. A badge fell from someone's lanyard and skittered across the floor near Morales's foot. A chair scraped backward against concrete. Somewhere in the corridor, a voice tried to form a sentence and found no sound to put behind it. The silence had weight. It pressed against every surface in Administrative Room 4 and against every person inside it. The AC vent, which had been cycling at baseline without anyone noticing it, became suddenly enormous in the ears. A boot scuffed tile somewhere near the door. A pen rolled off a surface and hit the floor, and the sound it made carried as if amplified. Small sounds filling the silence, each one making it feel more total. She stood in the center of all of it. She breathed. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. Her face did not change. Her posture did not change. Her eyes moved once around the room, cataloging, always cataloged, then settled on the document still in Holt's hands. His hands were trembling. Not aggressively, just there. General Ferris lowered his hand. He turned to face Holt directly, and there was no theatricality in his expression, no emphasis. Just accurate information, delivered by a man who dealt in accurate information. Commander Voss has been operating under a classified mandate from the Naval Inspector General's office for 14 weeks, he said. She was embedded at this installation under contractor cover to investigate unauthorized intelligence transfers through Fort Barrister's Eastern Data Corridor. Those transfers, spanning 11 months, resulted in the operational compromise of 3 field deployments and the deaths of 2 active operatives in the Horn of Africa. 1 pause. 1 beat. Every person in this room, including myself, answers to her authority. Holt's mouth was open, not theatrically, not as performance. The specific open mouth of a man who has run entirely out of processed language because the information arriving from his environment has exceeded his system's capacity to construct a response. His face cycled, surprise, rapid restructuring, denial, and then something that landed in his eyes with genuine, unperformed quietness. Something that looked, from a distance, like a reckoning. He was quiet. Not theatrical quiet. The other kind. Worse, The woman in the dark suit stepped forward with the efficiency of someone for whom this was the procedure. And the procedure was what mattered. Colonel Raymond Holt, you are being formally detained pending review of your involvement in the unauthorized data transfer network. An investigation has been opened by the Naval Inspector General's office in coordination with the relevant federal agencies. You have the right to legal counsel. I would strongly recommend you contact them immediately and advise them you will require significant representation. Holt looked at Commander Voss. She was already looking somewhere else. At the door. At the corridor beyond it. At what came after this room, after this base. After the 3 names now being processed through federal channels in 3 different cities with the same quiet institutional machinery that had been activated the moment her check-in protocol failed to register. Outside, in the corridor, the sound of military justice beginning its procedural work filled the air. Low voices, formal language, the specific vocabulary of people whose job is to ensure that what happened is on the record and will remain there. Not loud. Real consequences are never loud. Real consequences arrive quietly, in forms with signatures, and stay. She picked up her credentials case from the bench, clipped her operational badge to her jacket, walked out of Administrative Room 4, past the people in the corridor who moved to the sides as she passed, and into the main hallway. Master Sergeant Crane fell into step beside her. They walked toward the exit in the particular quiet of 2 people who have both been in enough situations to know that sometimes the right thing is simply to walk, and let the walking be enough. At the outer door, he held it open. She stepped through into the night air. He stopped beside her, looked at her. I knew at the rifle, he said. A quiet statement. Not an explanation, not a question. The record of a thing he had seen and recognized. The grip, she said, the angle of the wrists. A pause. Nobody gets that angle from a manual. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her face. Brief, controlled, but real. The acknowledgement of one person who has spent a career being invisible to another, who looked directly at her through 34 years of trained attention and saw exactly what was there. No, Sergeant, she said. They don't. She turned and walked into the night. Outside, the air was cool and carried the smell of cut grass from the eastern parade ground and jet fuel from the runway a quarter-mile away. Above the base, the sky had moved to a full clear black, stars hard and fixed in it. She walked to the edge of the vehicle yard and stood facing the perimeter fence and checked her watch. The secondary protocol had activated 63 minutes ago. The third, the formal review board escalation, filed in a different office in a different city, would process at 0600. By morning, 3 names on her list would be in federal custody in 3 separate locations. By noon, the data transfer network that had been running through the Eastern Corridor for 11 months would be fully mapped, documented, and added to a case file that would take 2 years to prosecute and result in outcomes that would not appear in any news report the public would access. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a photograph. Old, worn at the folding edges from too many jacket pockets over too many months. Printed on paper that had faded at the creases, it showed 2 operators in full-field kit standing in front of a transport aircraft on a tarmac somewhere hot and featureless. Both grinning. The specific grin of people who have just come through something that was not supposed to have a grin at the other end of it, and found one anyway. One of them was her. Younger, same eyes. One of them was a man named Torres, who had gone into the field 10 months ago on an operation that, according to the official after-action report, suffered a communications failure that resulted in support assets arriving 40 minutes late. Torres had not come home in any of the usual ways. She knew what the communications failure actually was. She had spent 14 weeks proving it. She had the proof. 3 of the 4 people responsible for it were now in custody. They mocked her rank. They forgot she outranked their corruption. She folded the photograph and returned it to her jacket. She breathed the cool air. She looked at the stars above Fort Barrister, above the Atlantic, above all the dark geography between here and the places she still had left to go. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. In her encrypted files, stored on 3 separate drives in 3 separate locations, accessible only through a protocol that activated on biometric confirmation, was a surveillance image. Taken from a camera positioned on the southern face of a building in Djibouti, 6 weeks before Torres's unit went in. The framing caught a rooftop across the street. The image showed a figure, posture, approximate height, profile visible in a 3/4 turn, who had no reason to be on that rooftop at that time, who appeared in none of the operation's official personnel documentation, and whose presence suggested a level of operational foreknowledge that could only have come from inside. Not clear enough to show a face, the figure's identity did not match any of the 3 names now in federal custody. Did not match Holt. Did not match anyone she had confirmed in 14 weeks of embedded work in this installation, or in the 3 preceding it. Someone had been on that rooftop. Someone was still out there. Tomorrow brings new ghosts to hunt. She stood one more moment at the edge of the vehicle yard, watching the perimeter lights trace their slow cycle. Then she put her shoulders back and walked to the waiting vehicle, and the driver opened the door without asking who she was, because she had been expected since 2203. And she got in, and the door closed, and the night outside the window moved past in silence as the base disappeared behind her. The photograph was still in her jacket pocket. She would carry it until the 4th name was found. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.